So I should say I considered for a while not making like full introductions because the open source ecosystem, I don't think you need to be introduced to them. But since there are a bunch of policymakers and people who are not day-to-day involved in open source here, let me just do a quick round. So we have Mike Milinkovic, the Executive Director of the Eclipse Foundation. We have Ruth Seeley, the President of the Apache Software Foundation. We have Mitchell Baker, the Chairwoman of the Mozilla Foundation. And we have Rebecca Rumble, the Executive Director and CEO of the Rust Foundation, and Gabriele Columbro, the General Manager of the Linux Foundation Europe and Executive Director of Finos. A lot of foundations and executive directors and chairs. So just to kind of set the stage and move away a little bit from the kind of big picture European strategy and politics view, and look at this other big picture of open source. 2024 was a very big year for open source, I find. So Gab, I heard you talking about it was the year of serious business. We saw, of course, the EU Cyber Resilience Act coming into force, and suddenly many of you here became open source software stewards. There were concerns over regulation, activity around regulation, concerns around export controls and sanctions. And at the same time, we saw the United Nations convening a very ambitious event calling for global cooperation on digital solutions built on open source. So Mitchell, let me start with possibly an annoyingly big question, very foundational. What is open source and an open source foundation in 2025? How should policymakers understand the role of open source and foundations?
That is the big question, I guess. I would say that open source foundations are the mark of a growing sophistication and breadth of possibility in open source. So when we started, well, it started really in universities. But the early open source projects, Apache obviously was early, Mozilla was early, were very much hacker-centered. And even something like program managers or quality assurance. Mozilla was an early program to have quality assurance. These were all new. And over time, as open source has developed, whole new capabilities have come in. And so the foundation model is started early. I think Apache was the first. I think Mozilla's second, maybe, but started early, but has really been growing, and with it is growing the kinds of expertise that you find in open source. So now, for example, we have plenty of program managers and project managers, but we also increasingly have CEOs or CFOs or financial people who are used to managing large amounts of money and having fiduciary duties and, come from a public company in the US background, engaged in open source. And so the level of sophistication it takes to run a foundation is pretty high because it's not as simple as running a normal business. And many of us do that with far less money than a normal business. And so we have different homes for foundations. In the US, you're stuck with the IRS idea of what a public charity should be. It's very, very complex to run such a thing in compliance with the law and try and actually build software and compete with the giants. And so maybe I'll stop at that point, but just reiterate that what the foundations are, especially now that we have them in Europe and the US and spreading in number and in home jurisdiction, is a sign that open source still has that ethic of builders, the hackers doing something that's important, but also spans the spectrum of capabilities and has grown into a new, I think, maturity and sophistication and ability to contribute to the public change and digital infrastructure in new ways.
Mitchell, I'm so glad you mentioned CFOs and financial, because I really shoehorned a question in here and it just gives me an opportunity for a segue. Because Gab, can you share your insights from your experience in the financial services industry? Maybe super quick for explain what Finos does and how you deal with open source in this highly regulated industry. What does that say about open source today?
Well, first of all, thank you. really excited to be here with some of the luminaries in this world. I wouldn't be here. I started in Apache as a committer maybe 15 years ago. So as Mitchell says, it's super easy to run a foundation with financial service institutions. But yeah, to your question, Finos brings together pretty much all the constituencies of the financial industry. It started with large investment banks that I heard that they had to do this thing called open source and it'd be good for them, but they didn't really have any idea of why and how to do it. We now bring together, both asset managers, exchanges, cloud service providers, and mind you, it wasn't, financial services has a hate and love relationship with big tech, very much like we, are discussing here in many ways. More hate than love, I would say. And so we now collaborate across really pre-competitive areas across these firms, whether it be regulation, whether it be infrastructure that they all depend on, whether it be, more recently AI, cloud, data standards, and also very specific financial service and investment banking standards. How do you deal with the sort of regulated nature? Well, you always have to start with, honestly, the first thing we had to do is start with why. In this industry, it's obviously all about ROI, it's all about business value. I tried to throw the Apache way at them at the beginning and say, hey, just write on the mailing list. I'm like, well, you mean the regulators are going to see it? It was a very, very different conversation than I was used to in open source communities. But then once you sort of are able to talk about the value, then you're able to address sort of the compliance issues that are naturally sort of something that very risk-conscious organizations in a regulated industry are familiar with. And so I guess to your question, to me, open source is really a positive sum game for the industry. Each one of these constituencies is in there for their own business value. Christina was pretty strong at talking about sort of the dual nature of open source, if you want to put it that way. But then that allows for more transparent regulation, that allows to democratize the market and other smaller organizations to jump in and build on the open source core that we now have there. And ultimately, as individuals, we enjoy, I think, a more transparent and hopefully, that's the idea, maybe in 5, 10, 20 years before my kids grow up, fair financial system. I'll close by saying that as open source becomes, and software becomes more regulated, there maybe are more parallels here between my experience and what we are all experiencing in the last couple of years, but I'm sure we'll cover this quite a bit.
Thank you, Gab. Another perfect way to end so I can segue over to the next question. Mike, is open source regulated now?
Yes. Next question.
So how is your experience now as an open source software steward? How is it going?
So yes, we're now regulated, but I think it's important to keep this in context and not panic. You can read all kinds of panicked blog posts on the internet. Not everything you read on the internet is true. I don't know if anyone's told you that, but the original version of the CRA would have been a real problem. The revised version I think, is like all human things flawed but livable. And it's important, like I started to say, it's important to keep this in context. The open source community, the open source ecosystem is not the target of the CRA. The target of the CRA is very laudable. It's to provide the citizens of Europe with safer, more secure devices and software that they use in their daily lives. Software runs our lives as citizens, and honestly, it's been a great ride. I mean, notice the white hair. I've managed to do my entire career in the software industry and not be regulated just up until it's time to retire. So I'm pretty happy about that. But I think it's actually long overdue. in some ways. I've thought for many years that the idea that software has gotten so powerful without any regulation was an imbalance, and the CRA goes I think in many ways the right direction. The problem is like we're not the target of the CRA, but we came very, very close to being roadkill. So that was a wake-up call for all of us. I think amongst the complexities that Mitchell was talking about in terms of running open source foundations, a couple of years ago, public policy and geopolitics were not on my job description, and was not something that I was even the slightest bit interested in, I would say. And it turns out that, boy, was I wrong. And that's now become front and center. So the question is then, as we go about implementing the CRA, what can we do? And there's lots of words in the CRA that still are kind of undefined. Like open source software steward, right, with a light touch regulatory regime. I don't know if you know this, but when it comes to regulation, the weight of the touch is in the eye of the beholder. And so we still have a lot of work to do in terms of implementing the CRA. There's so many little details and nuances over the next couple of years that could have enormous impact on how we deal as developers and as citizens with this new life of regulation. And so, that's one of the things that we're doing at the Eclipse Foundation with the Open Regulatory Compliance Working Group. This is my shameless plug, to try to gather the foundations, the open source software stewards, together with the manufacturers to figure this stuff out. And that is actually, we had 2 days of workshops here. Of course, the Brussels, the famous open source Brussels week. It's been fantastic. And great progress is being made, but oh my gosh, is there ever an awful lot of work left to do. And I still highly encourage all of you. Many people in this room were engaged in part of the work in fixing the CRA. Your work, our work, is not done. You have to stay diligent. There's so many details and nuances that need to be worked out over the next couple of years, and we all have to stay alert and figure out and make sure that all of those little reviews and notes and standards and all of these things are actually reflective of how software really works today. And I'll just close with one final thought, which is, the standards, the European harmonized standards that are going to implement the CRA are going to be extremely impactful. Keep in mind that there is not a single security standard that I've read on the planet today that actually reflects how software is built today. They're all built assuming that it's a proprietary organization that has complete control of the software development lifecycle. All the code is written by one organization. They can even lock down the developers' workstations. And everybody in this room knows that's not true and hasn't been true for a very long time. So evolving standards that actually reflect reality in the very short time frame that we have is an enormous challenge. And so looking forward to a fun 3 years.
Rebecca, we can probably discuss, and if we accept the premise, if open source is regulated, fully light touch regime, etc. But maybe to turn around, should there be more regulation? Like, to play devil's advocate, given the vulnerabilities that have kind of shaken trust in both proprietary and open source software in just the last 5 years, are we, the broader ecosystem, I'm not doing much to solve this, I have to say directly, but the broad ecosystem, the security experts, are we truly addressing the twin challenges of sustainability and security in open source? Are we on top of it?
I think we're getting there. To answer the first part of your question, I'm pretty pro good regulation. I'm not just pro regulation across the board because I think we all know how bad regulation goes. But good regulation, I think, is a really good incentive. It's a really good catalyst for us to do better, to be more coherent, and to keep in mind the end user. As Mike said just now, the point of the CRA is not to make our lives harder. It's so that my old dad, when he's on his mobile phone and he's doing something, mobile banking, God knows whatever, but that he's secure, you know, that normal people get the benefit of security. And I like the fact that security is finally important. You know, I can remember being here a couple of years ago and we were talking about it, and the kind of spotlights of the world governments had finally been cast in our direction. And it was really nice to talk about security in a proactive way, in a let's bake it in, not bolt it on kind of way, you know. Gone are the days, thankfully, for most of us, where you've just got one guy whose job it is security, and he gets brought in after the fact, after the software's been built, after, you know, everything's been done. You know, oh, let me just install your antivirus on your computer. We all remember those days, right? Never worked. It was terrible. So I'm glad that, you know, regulation and policymakers showing an interest has actually prompted us to think a lot harder about this and do it a lot better. Obviously, shameless plug for Rust, you know, the memory safety. It solves quite a few of those security issues. But security and sustainability, you put them together in that question and they're two different things. Security isn't a one-time thing. We're really grateful at the foundation that we have annual grants to do security work. It's wonderful. Alpha Omega, shout out, thank you very much. But a one-off grant for a year, I can't fix security in 1 year because security has changed. You know, the goalposts move all the time. Security is a constant thing. So not only do we need to sustain that security, we need to maintain it as well. And as others have said here and in the panel beforehand, maintenance is where the problem is. Maintenance costs money. Maintenance costs me time. Maintenance is a huge cost that no one ever sees. Pierce made a bit of a kind of an offhand comment in the panel before ours. Oh, you know, is this code just gonna, like, you know, be not maintained and live in a foundation library? That still costs me money. You know, that's it. We still have to host that. That's still out there, even if it's not being maintained. You know, there is a cost to all of this stuff, and that's something that for me is the problematic thing with regulation, is that it doesn't come with a stick to tell people that monetize this, that they need to kind of contribute to this kind of upstream environment. You know, in other areas of regulation, you have organizations that are required to pay as part of that regulation. You know, data protection, for instance. If you are a data processor or a data controller, you have to pay a fee to register as that, and that goes into the regulation. I'm on the board of the Advertising Standards Authority in the UK. The advertising industry pays to be regulated. So a big question for me is, yeah, like as open source foundations, we're totally here for the regulation. We want security. We want to do good work. But, you know, who's helping us out with this? Because this just seems to be all, here's more work for you.
Another great segue opportunity. I can even go back to, Mitchell mentioned earlier just, you know, the new challenges for foundations, what they are in 2025. And I think it's important to underscore just the diversity of foundations. The now recently dubbed open source software stewards are very different in terms of structure, governance, culture, norms. And in many ways, Apache Software Foundation stands out with its volunteering tradition. So Ruth, I'm thinking, from an ASF point of view, being, you know, a very particular kind of foundation, are you ready to tackle the regulatory demands, the new efforts? How are you looking at these new challenges?
Oh, absolutely. And I always like to look at where we are now in a historical context. So Mike referred to how his job has rather changed in the last, say, 2 years or so. So if you go back to the late 90s, really, so the term open source was coined in 1998. It didn't appear out of nowhere. We were already somewhere at that point. But if you look at news stories around late 99, early 2000, all of the Y2K era hype, actually one of my favorite headlines is from the New York Times on January 1st, 2000, if I remember right. The headline is, "Free access to a software code may come into its own." So I'm still waiting for my A software code. But there's a ton of press right around then about open source software. And then nothing. And for the next 25-ish years, there were a lot of us who were working on software in this way that was philosophical. We were driven by a meaning in what we did and a belief in that open source development was the right way to develop software. Except a side effect of that being true, in my opinion, is that over the next 25 years, it became absolutely indispensable. And open source software is, at the very least, a component of literally everything you do from the time you wake up in the morning now. And then, about 3 years ago, I think the rest of the world woke up after 25 years of not seeing the term open source and discovered that that was true, and here we are today. Now, conveniently, the ASF, having spent the last 25 years thinking about this, has had the opportunity to build what I think is a really robust system, but also still growing with the opportunity to be flexible of how to deal with where we are, because we didn't just wake up one morning 25 years later. So we have spent all that time building industry best practices around things like release engineering and dependency management and responsible disclosures. And in addition, something that I think is going to be increasingly important as we are all aging and our software is as well, Apache has a distinct process for dealing with software that is no longer actively managed. So we call it the Apache Attic, and I've seen in many companies there isn't even a great process for a lot of them of how to deal with their own products that they aren't supporting anymore. And it's true of the open source ecosystem as well. We often are not doing a great job of dealing with things that nobody's looking at anymore. So Apache has this method called the Attic, again, for letting users know this is no longer actively managed, this is no longer actively supported, as well as an option on the other side, a way for us to put new life back into those projects should that time come later down the road. So yeah, I think Apache is in a great place and always happy to help others in the ecosystem with all of those things, all of those lessons we've learned over the last 25 years. So we've all been building software through this collaborative method, but I think now what we're finally getting to is the part where we do a much better job of collaborating with one another. So as Mike mentioned, the Eclipse, the ORC working group that we've been here the last couple of days working on, initiatives like that, and truly collaborating amongst ourselves and working together even more than we ever have before.
And Mitchell, I'm thinking here trying to pivot the conversation a little bit away from regulation, which I don't think we'll completely be able to do. So today's theme is what can open source do for Europe? So of course I'll then give you the other kind of €1,000,000 question here at any policy event. But what can Europe do to get the most out of open source?
Well, I'd actually like to broaden that maybe a little bit. And so what could Europe do to get the most out of open source, but also include what can Europe do to assist open source to get the most out of open source? Because I think there's a real, it's an opportunity and a moment now as open source has gotten more sophisticated. We have all these foundations and there are more, like we're not the only ones. Beginning to work together to actually elevate the open source ecosystem even further. Right? One of the issues of open source, there's sustainability, of course, there's all of the development pieces, there's the model, there's dealing with regulation, there's what's a technical stack that can actually compete. Because that's like the big question of innovation, and if you want sovereignty and you want more choice than the tech giants from Silicon Valley or China, like you need a stack of software, not just what any one foundation is doing, but a set of alternatives. And my experience in the open source world is there's more and more acknowledgement, sophistication, interest in doing that, but it also needs a regulatory and a support environment. Like the regulation with no resources to address anything might make sense when you're dealing with commercial entities who have businesses generating large amount of cash and you feel like they should pay the cost. But for those of us trying to use open source to build public benefit, they're often, like there isn't that revenue generation piece. And so I think there's a real opportunity in Europe to be a home for this construction of open source into the new layers. And I think that's also how Europe gets the best out of it, because open source has, I think, demonstrated over its history something that's a little counterintuitive, which is that you don't need to own everything, but if you are the leader and the home and you're part of the philosophy and you are where people come and attract, I mean, that's what Silicon Valley is, right? It's the network. And to be the network home that's supportive with both good regulation, but also the tools for the open source world to grow and address them, there's a huge opportunity there. And that as I say, that leadership role and being the place where people come to make this happen has a power, for innovation and change and network effects and all of those things that we look for.
I mean, this is a pretty great question, I think, to open up as well, because it gives you all chances to put forward some policy recommendations. Thinking, Mike, I bet you have some in your back pocket.
How much time do you got? Rebecca mentioned a program called Alpha Omega a few minutes ago. For those who haven't heard of it, Alpha Omega is part of OpenSSF. It's a pool of money that's funded by those big tech people that we were just talking about in the previous panel as the enemy. But they're the ones that are actually paying foundations like the Rust Foundation, like the Eclipse Foundation, I think even now Apache's in a little bit, to secure help secure their projects. We're huge fans of the Sovereign Tech Agency and the work that they're doing, and we're enjoying the benefit of that as well. But something like an Alpha Omega funded by Europe would be massive. That would be so wonderful.
Could you give a super quick explanation of Alpha and Omega?
Yeah, sorry. It's so you go to Alpha Omega with a proposal that says, if you give us X number of dollars, we can do the following things to improve the security of our projects and community. So in our case, we're doing things like hardening our infrastructure to reduce the risk of supply chain attacks. 3 years ago, we had 0 dedicated headcount working on security at the Eclipse Foundation, and right now we have 6. And those people are being funded by a mix of Alpha Omega money and some sovereign tech agency money. And everybody benefits from that. So when we talk about, there's so many different aspects to sustainability and maintainability and I love what some of the stuff talking, stop this mania about innovation. Yes, innovation is important. And we all love innovation. That's what, gets us out of bed in the morning. But the stuff that's, like the Eclipse IDE is now 23 years old. And there's still at least 1.5 million daily users. When you get, code like that and you want to keep it secure, you want to keep it moving, you got to, all these things, that's hard. It's actually in some ways harder than innovating. And to a certain degree, that's, by the way, that's what foundations do, is we're a trusted intermediary between the stakeholders that are consuming the technology and the stakeholders that are producing the technology. Fundamentally, that's what foundations do, and plus some governance things in the middle. But it's that trust nature of the foundations that really is what keeps us going. So back to the question, so policy, so things like Alpha Omega, the competitiveness strategy that we see coming from the new mandate, I think is heading in the right direction. So Eclipse, speaking about working in regulated environments, we do, our fastest growing community at the Eclipse Foundation is software-defined vehicle working in the automotive space, which, as everybody knows, is highly regulated. And one of the things that we're kind of think is really exciting is getting into open source functional safety, which is a whole different topic. But in terms of, so making sure that open source is part of the competitiveness agenda for the next 5-year mandate, I think is absolutely key. So when there's funding there's just an announcement yesterday about the automotive sector, and making sure that open source is part of that strategy is critical in my view.
Just want to throw in, kind of connect what Mike said, and what some of the panelists actually before were discussing. I mean, we're super excited to, I think, to the idea of supporting and working together across foundations. I think OpenSSF and many others are doing a great job. But it's also important to understand that, as Mike said, you know, it's the same big tech players that we're attacking that we're actually supporting that. And I think to what the previous panelists were saying, I think my message is that we have to keep open source global because that continues to fuel this innovation. It's perfectly okay and desirable, and I say it with my Italian passport, well, maybe not here, but in my backpack, to have a Eurostack, to have a commercial ecosystem that is Europe first. But that should not be conflated with fragmenting open source and having regional specific open source, because it's going to create a whole set of side effects that we in the bubble maybe can see, and we're not maybe as good at communicating out. And so I think this is something that I hope is going to come across throughout the day. Let's make sure that we keep open source global, don't reinvent the wheel.
So respectfully, Astor, I'd like to disagree with the phrasing of the question itself.
Good.
The question, how can anyone insert noun here? Can you read exactly what you said?
I winged it, so I don't remember.
I think you said get the most out of open source. We all understand the benefits of open source, which are there not only for Europe but for the whole world. But industry asking how can I get the most out of open source has led to the sustainability problems that we have now. And so how all of us are going to continue to benefit from the open source ecosystem for the next 25 years and beyond is to stop looking at it that way and to look at it as something to be participated in, not something to be taken from.
But would you even say that it is one of those situations that the more you put in, the more you get out?
Absolutely.
But actually, I want to riff on that a bit, because I think one of the reasons why I'm cautiously optimistic about the CRA is that it puts a new incentive into the loop that has never existed before. So for years, industry has looked as open source as, thanks for the free stuff, suckers. And there's been nothing that has motivated them to spend any time with the project, to even really know what the project is. It's just download the code, put it in the product, ship it, right? And now there's a new incentive in the loop that has never been there before. Now, that could be a very positive thing, but one of the things my brain is always worrying is, what if 3 years from now all of industry shows up at all of the projects on the same day saying, "Hey, can we help with your security policies?" So there's things that could be kind of complex there in the middle, but like I said, I'm cautiously optimistic that there's a new incentive to pay attention to the open source that they're putting in their products that has never existed before. And so let's see how that works out.
And conveniently, we've all spent a lot of time building these vendor-neutral homes for them to come to do exactly that.
But then I feel like it's really interesting because it's a very different conversation around the CRA today than we had, let's say, 3 years ago, right? But one of the things that have been discussed from the start is, okay, this is Europe's regulation. Other jurisdictions are expected to follow in different ways, inspired to probably different extents by the CRA. As a global movement around collaborative innovation, where borders historically haven't been as real as they might be in a few years, even between open source contributors. Could I get some comments just on, it's a classic topic in Brussels, but regulatory harmonization globally? What opportunities, benefits do you see in the current situations? What risks do you see? I don't know who wants to take it first.
Can we skip the next 4 years? Because after that, it might be easier to talk about.
But what are you hearing? I mean, you're all active globally, right?
Can I jump in? So I think fragmentation of regulations is one of the probably biggest risks for the open source community. If we have to comply with completely different regulations in every jurisdiction. This is something that is going to just exponentially grow the pressure on maintainers, to an extent to stewards, especially to the smaller stewards. But I want to, again, I guess I'm an optimist. Regulation, I guess the solution in my mind is open source itself. Let me explain. Again, drawing a parallel with the finance industry. A couple of years ago, global regulators were vastly worried about cloud concentration. They still are. Banks are worried about the growing cost of complying with different regulations in different jurisdictions around what cloud security means. So they came together and they started building what in finance we call common cloud controls. And it's just really a broad industry consensus-based set of controls that then they can bring back to regulators and hopefully be used as reference, used as a maximum common denominator, a Rosetta Stone of sort, to map existing regulations. And so, yes, I think especially from a geopolitical standpoint, it's going to be hard to have that top-down policymaker level agreement on regulations. I think that is naive, and I would not expect that to happen, honestly, regardless of the administration. Each region needs to look at its own, generally looks at its own advantage. But we have a responsibility as an open source community to try, and I think through OpenSSF in the Linux Foundation, we've tried to provide tools, that again harmonize this, try to make it as simple as possible for maintainers, manufacturers, and hopefully other foundations, open source projects in general, to comply with the regulations. And just today, OpenSSF started following a workshop we had in Amsterdam, started working groups to actually work on global harmonization of cybersecurity regulation. I think it's very complementary to what Mike and Ruth were talking about. There's a global angle, there's a European angle. I think we can work all together on this. So in a way, probably the solution is industry consensus and sort of global collaboration on the tools, processes, and standards.
I feel like there's a chance here to shoehorn in a policy recommendation. Isn't it interesting? I'm thinking, and completely winging this now, but with a lot of the regulation coming out now, complying with the regulation shouldn't be an area where companies try to find competitive advantage.
Absolutely.
And there, open source plays a very interesting role. Maybe there should be earmarked funds with every piece of regulation coming out of the EU to put it into open source collaboration around compliance and enforcement tools. It should probably be quite cheap.
Well, I wouldn't sell it as cheap, because that gets us back to the problem about free software. Right, I would sell it as necessary as part of the security infrastructure.
But in tight budgetary times in the EU, it's a good message.
But there's also an advantage for the regulators themselves.
Yeah.
In terms of transparency, in terms of actually talent, when they go about enforcing these regulations. Generally, in the financial industry, they cannot compete with the entities they regulate in terms of hiring the best talent. And so you always have this complexity. That, again, it's important also to regulators and enforcers to understand that they gain as well if we are to collaborate on open regulations.
Yeah, it's a good idea. I just jumped to the one piece. But,
Not easy.
But I'm totally on board that, free software, it's all free. It's not free.
No.
Right, it's not free of cost.
I'm thinking here I'm going to try to combine, 8 questions I have left in the next 4 minutes. But Mike, you referred to, when you talked about the CRA, you were like, open source was about to end up as roadkill. Something that at OFE we've found, I don't know what the word is. Frustrating is not really strong enough. But I talked about how big open source is today as in my opening statement. And it's getting kind of silly that open source ends up being hit by unintended consequences. There's almost a question, come with some intended consequences for once. So I'm thinking, if that was the case with the CRA, where the Commission, to its credit from the start, showed an intention to work with open source and making sure that there weren't disproportionate regulatory pressures on the open source model. How do the foundations look at the future, considering the risks of not having harmonized regulatory expectations in different jurisdictions? How will you work together to deal with this? Working together in an open source way is pretty good when you're not as resourced as big tech companies. How are you making sure that there won't be unintended consequences to open source?
Well, the answer to the true answer to that is we can't. Like, unintended consequences are by their very nature random, and so things can and will happen. But I think the near-death experience that the CRA gave us has certainly provided all of the foundations, the open source software stewards in many cases, the realization that we have to spend more time paying attention to regulation, which is really honestly quite something that we weren't really doing too much of up till recently. So, but the thing about it is that just has put more of a burden on the foundations. Like, every one of the foundations here, we are nonprofits. No matter how big we are, or how big you might think we are all incredibly resource constrained inside. And we've added public policy and watching regulation to the list of the umpteen list of other things that we're doing. So that is definitely a struggle. So I can't say that there's never going to be unintended consequences again, because I don't think anybody can promise that. But what I can say is that we are a lot more vigilant now than we've ever been before, and we realize that we can be part of the blast radius of a regulation. I think to a large degree, up until the CRA, we lived in a world of blissful ignorance. So it's like, well, we're doing open source, and of course it's global, and of course anybody can use it, and of course it's free, and of course it's nonprofit, and like, why would anybody regulate us? And so that naivete is now gone, and so I think we're both a lot more aware and a lot more diligent.
So yesterday I had a super quick conversation with last year's Basil Cousins Award winner, Jennifer Tridgell, who is writing her PhD in open source and international law. There aren't so many people looking into those things, so I'm very excited that she is. And she said this thing that I just took with me, where she was like, every time I talk to the lawyers, they're like, oh, why did you pick such a niche topic? And then she said, and every time I talk to the computer science department, they say, how could you possibly write about something that huge? And I think here on this stage, I would classify you as closer to the computer science department in that analogy, understanding the hugeness and size of open source, the importance and the value that's carried by it. But a lot of people don't see it. It is part of infrastructure. It is not necessarily consumer-facing. How are you going to communicate this broadly to the public, to policymakers? What are you going to do? It is, I think, kind of not only on you, the foundations, but you're best placed.
I want to jump in, because I think it's the responsibility of every person in this room and every person that you work with to get the message out. When we did the CRA thing, one of the things we found out is the people in the commission were well-intentioned, but they just didn't get it. And like, have you ever tried to explain how open source works to your mom? Right? It's like,
Some of us moms.
yeah, well, whatever. I mean, like, we have this innate understanding of how this works and how important it is. And you don't have to go very far outside of this room to find people who go, I don't know what open source is, and why would I ever care? Right? So we collectively have to do a lot better job explaining what we do, and more importantly, and why it's important. Like, nobody actually understands that the world works on open source. And we up until very recently, none of us really thought it was important to communicate that. But I think now that we do.
Yeah, I've had a different experience to both, and I think maybe that's because Mozilla produces a consumer product, Firefox. So my experience is not that the world missed open source for 25 years. And again, and it relates a little bit to that piece, like you might call it the sad reality, like the power of the market and the consumer market is unbelievable, and that's what drives consumer sentiment, is what they experience. And so the reason I didn't experience open source being lost for 25 years is because I did hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of interviews with media outlets around the globe when Firefox was released. What is open source? Why would anybody collaborate? Why is it not less secure than, IE, of all things, right? Like hundreds of interviews, and I think it's open source that brought open into the consumer life. We didn't have any sharing, we didn't have Uber, we didn't have collaboration, we didn't have open education, we didn't have open access, we didn't have open architecture, we didn't have open anything until open source came into the mainstream. And in the consumer side, Apache was the developer side, but on the consumer side, that was Mozilla. So my experience has been that something about open and open source is fundamental in society today. You can see open everywhere. Why is that? That came from us. That came from open source. And so I think it's a little bit different that it's been adopted, it's mainstream, but as concepts become mainstream, they become very shallow. Like you wouldn't expect a consumer worried about a mortgage and kids to know what we know. And so there is still the patina or the open washing of open, which is real. But then, to your point, like the details of what it means for open in the digital infrastructure, 100% agree that like the consumer base doesn't understand that. I don't think we should expect them to. I do think for policymakers, we should make that expectation, but also in partnership in learning and teaching. But if and when, like that's why I was so honored to be able to present the award last night to Amandine for Matrix and Element, because that is, again, another effort that if you can tap into users, and especially the consumer mainstream, which, on their roadmap, if they could get funded, you have a power in explanation that people are interested. And so, again, I think, how can Europe both help and benefit, and innovation and creativity is providing some more support, both for infrastructure but also for consumer products, because that level of understanding, like you cannot get people to like learn stuff because it's good for them, right? And so.
Well, we have 30 seconds left, so I'm gonna go into a quick round of just call to action or whatever these good policy panels are supposed to end on. But let me ask you this. Can we expect a more unified voice from the open source foundations going forward? And
yes.
what is it that you're going to work together on?
Open Source Congress here in Brussels this September. And for those who don't know, Open Source Congress has happened twice up till now. First by the Linux Foundation, second by the Open Atom Foundation in China. It's basically a gathering of open source foundations. And the next one is going to be here in Brussels in September.
And what are you going to work on together?
We're still collaborating on the agenda. I'm pretty sure regulation will be on the list.
We're making a plan for the plan.
Very good. Well, thank you very much, all of you.